So this guy walks into Starting Strength Boston the other day, right? And he comes up to me and he says, "Hey, I'd like to learn the standing barbell shoulder press, the overhead press, but I got an issue. I keep impinging my shoulder." So I says to the guy, I look at him, right? I look at him, I says to him, I says, "Shoulder? I barely know her." Hey guys, Coach Michael here today at Starting Strength Boston, and we're going to be talking about freedom of the press, the classic press-a-roni pizza. They call me Ranch because I be pressing, #Prexit. Let me know in the comments down below what you think that means. Wrong answers only. Today we're going to be talking through the press, as it's outlined in this blue book right here. The standing barbell press, the overhead press, as some will call it. And I'm going to detail this just like my squat and deadlift video, so I'm going to go through the anatomy and the mechanics. So let's just get right into it, all right? All right, press anatomy. So as everybody knows, the press heavily involves the shoulder, right? And the biggest concern with the press is this giant, scary word right here, impingement, right? So impingement happens when you have two bony structures and they pinch some soft tissue between them and it goes ouchy. We don't want that, all right? So in the press, the way impingement can occur is you have the scapular back here, right? That bony structure we talked about a little bit in the squat and the deadlift. And then we have the humerus, right? This little bone of the upper arm right here. And those two bones, when you're kind of coming up like this, they can kind of pinch together. And the tissue that often gets pinched is the rotator cuff, right? You have four tiny little muscles there that connect your scapular to your humerus. So those can get pinched in between, right? And so in order to avoid that and have that not happen, what we got to do is shrug at the very top of the press, right? And so the shrug, what that does is it rotates the scapular, which is usually kind of sideways like this, and points it up like this and creates a little space. So if this is the head of my humerus, this is my scapular, right? We got impingement right here. If I just shrug the scapular, boom, big old space. And now I can kind of, my rotator cuff, which is my face in this example, can just travel freely between those two bones. So we avoid impingement by doing that. Now the press is the hardest lift that there is. There's an anatomical reason for that and a mechanical reason for that. Let's start with the anatomical. The prime movers in the press are the anterior delts and the triceps. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that those are really, really tiny muscles compared to some of the other bigger prime movers, like with the squat and the deadlift. We're using a lot of the glutes, the big old hip extensors, right? So we got real tiny muscles doing most of the work, so it's gonna make the most sense that we're gonna lift the least amount of weight with the press of the four main barbell movements. The press is also a great example of the concept of prime movers and postural muscles. So if you have no idea what prime movers means when I just dropped that term, so the prime movers contract either concentrically or eccentrically during the movement. So during the press, it's concentric, right? Shortening. So the anterior delt and the tricep are doing a lot of the work. They're causing like movement essentially. And then everything from the abs and the lower back and the spine and the lats and the glutes and the quads, everything below that is just contracting isometrically, which means there's no shortening or lengthening, no movement whatsoever. And it's just holding everything rigid essentially. So if you've ever heard of like, staying tight during the press, it just means like keep everything contracted isometrically while this is doing the pressing so that you can actually, well, I'll talk about it in the mechanical section, what that does. All right, let's talk about the mechanics of the press, all right? The most important thing is the bar path. So the bar path in the press is very finicky for a couple of reasons here, and these all kind of relate to each other. But the biggest reason here is the moment arm, right? So when you're performing a press, the biggest moment arms at play are the moment arm between the bar and the shoulder and the bar and the elbow. So the shoulder is a really important one, right? The shoulder is the anterior delt, your prime mover. And so you want the bar to be over that as soon as possible on the way up. And the bar path in the press is not vertical, it is a diagonal line, straight up and back. So you're gonna start over about the middle of your foot, and then you're gonna wind up right over your ears, right about here. Okay? And so you want to close the moment arm between the bar and the shoulder as quickly as possible. If you ever watch like a really heavy press, someone will kind of like pop it right up. And if it goes like straight up, what happens is the bar just kind of stops for a second. They do like the layback and their body contorts like they're being exercised by an exorcist, not actually being exercised by the movement. And then they start, all of a sudden the bar like kind of drifts backwards and gets over the shoulder joint, and then they lock it out. And that's usually because there was a moment arm present between the shoulder and the bar. And that moment arm can be like this big, and because that muscle is so small, it can't produce a ton of force, and so it's not really well equipped to resist even the tiniest of moment arms. So that's why it becomes so hard when you separate the bar from the shoulder and create that moment arm. And then as far as the kinetic chain goes, this is just like, and the kinetic chain goes very far, by the way, as I'm about to talk about. Like I was saying in the anatomy section, the press uses the smallest prime movers, and it also has the longest kinetic chain of any of the four main movements. So the kinetic chain is basically the area to where you start producing force, and then that's where it starts, and then it ends at the barbell, right? So in the press, you can kind of think of the kinetic chain as like an electrical current. So it's starting at the floor at your feet, and then you're transferring force all the way through your entire body up to your shoulder, and then all the way through your arm into your hands into the bar. So it's like a very, very long kinetic chain. There's a lot that can go wrong between there and there. It's like a game of telephone. So like if your quads come loose and your knees bend, or like if your abs aren't tight enough, you're leaking force through your midsection. Those are all bad things that are gonna result in leaving weight off the bar in the press. And so like even just small details like that can affect your press 1 rep max, right? But that's basically it for the mechanics, and now we can kind of talk about how this all ties in together. So we've gone through the anatomy and the mechanics of the press, and then considering those principles, there are a couple things to keep in mind when programming the press based off that. So first thing, the press is very technical, right? So like I was saying, that moment arm makes a huge difference because you don't have a lot of wiggle room, right? You have small prime movers, and you have a very long kinetic chain. So there's a lot that can go wrong in the kinetic chain, like I said. And then because the small prime movers aren't producing a lot of force, basically you don't have a lot of wiggle room with messing up the technique. In other words, they can't easily overcome the force just with like brute force, essentially, like in a deadlift, using so many muscles, and they're so big that if there's like a small moment arm on the midfoot, you can still kind of overcome it and finish the lift. Press, you don't have that luxury. Oh, and for that reason, you need to practice the press a lot, right? Because you need to make sure that bar path is nice and grooving. You're not making mistakes and stuff like that. So it's better if you're able to practice the press more often in your programming. And you can practice the press a lot because of this second thing right here. So the press is not heavy, right? The press is really hard, but it's not actually heavy in that it's not as taxing on the system like a deadlift or even like a bench press or a squat. So you can do the press, 3 or 4 times a week, and it's not going to beat the heck out of you, especially if you're programming it in an intelligent fashion. So you have the luxury of being able to practice the press quite often. Like you probably wouldn't want to squat 4 times a week, and if you did, you'd have to kind of make a lot of concessions, and it'd be really unnecessary. But with the press, you can actually press relatively heavy with a good bit of intensity 3 to 4 times a week, and get pretty good results. So practice the press a lot if you want it to go up. Keep in mind it's not like heavy. As long as you're doing a good job of programming it in an intelligent fashion, then you're going to see results. But yeah, that's it for the video. If you guys want to hear more about the press, leave a comment down below. I'll probably make a video on like assistance movements for each of these main movements. I'll do a press one at some point. We'll talk about some of those good assistance movements. But yeah, that's it. Have a great day, pal.